Almost 2 months ago, I made a video about The Crow 2024, and in that video, I speculated that this new version would be for the romance girlies and serve some nostalgic aesthetics and vibes. And now that I've seen it, I can say that I was right.
You were given the power of a god.
Hi, I'm LadyJenevia, and on my channel I like to talk about entertainment media. Another week, another new film released at the cinema for me to review on here, and if you're not new to my channel, you will know the routine by now. Spoiler-free section first, then a spoiler section, and you can proceed as far into spoilers as you prefer. I would recommend, if you haven't already done so, that you watch my previous video about The Crow, simply because I covered a lot of the talking points that seem to be among the most discussed, and probably the most contentious as well. I don't want to explain all of those things in depth again, since I talked about the argument about whether or not there should be a new film in the first place, people's strong attachment to the 1994 film starring Brandon Lee, among other things. Now, there may be a few more spoilers than usual in my spoiler-free section, but only insofar as The Crow already has a very established premise, and a couple of mild spoilers to do with some of the differences between this version and other versions. I'm also going to say something brief about essay, R-word, to do with what's in the source material, so just be advised about that. I'm actually going to do that first, just to get it out of the way. One of the changes that they made to this new version that I really appreciated, that instantly ups the rewatchability factor of this new version, is that they do not have Shelley, that's FKA Twigs' character, being essayed when she and Eric are killed. The film from the 90s does show that, and the original limited series source material is extremely dark in what it does to Shelley. In that source material, she is gang R-worded, and the main villain takes his turn after she's already dead. With all due respect, I am increasingly selective about which stories I'm willing to watch that include that type of material, and when you're talking about a story that focuses on grief and despair over losing a loved one, I do not believe that essay is necessary to address those topics. Author James O'Barr lost his fiancée to a drunk driver. Essay was not part of his own experience of losing the woman that he loved, the very experience that inspired the creation of The Crow in the first place. The thread that ties these different versions of The Crow together, whether it's the source material, the 1994 film, or this new version, is this pain and despair of losing a loved one. This new version puts far more emphasis on the love story of Eric and Shelley. Shelley is barely in those other versions. She's a ghost, a memory, a flashback, but Shelley in this version actually gets to be a character, a three-dimensional human being. This new story is not a mere rehash of what we've already seen. It interprets the source material in its own way. If you fundamentally will not be moved from the notion that no other versions of The Crow should be made, nothing I say in this video is going to change your mind. And if you're really fixated on that Brandon Lee version, then I would definitely recommend that you buy the 4K version on physical media. They just released that this year. If it's that important of a version to you, you can contribute to the preservation of it and the ongoing production of physical media. I like this new take on the story because of where it ventures to genre-wise, and the motivation for the villains is more interesting. I've seen some chatter of people feeling as though the villains and their motivation wasn't explained enough. I understood it perfectly fine. It made all the sense to me as a viewer. Instead of having superficial villains that only do bad things because they're bad people, I know what the villains in this new version want. I don't think the naysayers of this new version can have it both ways. It makes no sense to say that there shouldn't be a new version because the other version is better, and then complain that these new villains aren't developed enough. The villains in the source material, as well as the 1994 film, none of those characters were developed. They were cartoonishly evil. There was no deeper, nuanced exploration of their motivations, nor did the story require such a thing because ultimately The Crow is not about the villains. The first film was focusing on the vengeance quest born from this rage and despair and trauma of losing a loved one, and this new version is more so asking a question of how far would you go to save someone that you love? Similar, but not identical. Visually, I really liked the look of both Eric and Shelley, as well as some of the other details for this world building. These pink uniforms for the facility where Eric and Shelley meet, they really look like a stylish music video. It was reminding me of Eva Simon's Guaya. Maybe not so much in the coloring, but more so having that juxtaposition of wearing really cute loungewear in a more rugged, industrial-looking location. This facility also helps to establish this sense of making the viewer feel feel like this story does not exist in our world. It very much feels like its own original place where you're being transported by watching the story. There was a lot of emphasis on the supernatural elements, which was another nostalgic quality for me as a viewer. Nowadays, it feels like the supernatural genre is more prevalent in places like horror, but this type of grungy supernatural story feels very reminiscent of things that you might see in the 2000s when there were a lot more films that seemed to come out in the mainstream that would focus on any number of supernatural elements as a source of creative inspiration, whether it was vampires, witches, demons, anything and everything that you can think of. On the one hand, I think I would have liked to learn even more details about some of the supernatural lore of this story, but on the other hand, as I've already said, the story is first and foremost focusing on this visceral emotional despair and grief that Eric feels when he loses Shelley. I loved Eric and Shelley's relationship in this film. I fully believed their connection to one another. The film was very effective in establishing how each of them is accustomed to life being extremely rough and painful, that the world and the people around them do not treat them with kindness. And then you get to watch this stark contrast of how they are with one another. They're drawn to each other, they make this connection, and they're just so incredibly sweet and loving with one another. I love a good romance, okay? And I love finding a romantic connection between characters in genres outside of the more straightforward romance genre stories. In an interview Bill did with Esquire, a number of other people that he's worked with in his career were quoted, including his co-star FKA Twigs. The film was shot in Prague over the course of about 4 months, mainly at night. It was long and grueling, but gratifying. The project marks Twigs' first lead role, and she fully credits Skarsgård with making the experience a rewarding one. Working with Bill has changed the trajectory of my career, really, she says. He gave me a lot of confidence. He was very tender with me. The pair of them being able to have such a supportive working relationship really translated well on screen. I'm glad that the experience was as good as this quote seems to suggest, and that it ultimately translated into what was shown for Eric and Shelley's relationship.
You feel like my person.
You feel like my person.
Even a fair few critical voices and naysayers of the film seem to still be willing to show praise to the film's action, and deservedly so. Some of the most memorable sequences are, of course, the one that's in a car that's moving through a tunnel, and the one that happens at the Opera House, both of which are previewed in the film's trailer. I found that it didn't overly chop the editing to where you couldn't follow what's happening in the action. That's a complaint that I often have with the worst output of Hollywood action, and they use the space and location really well. When you have a fight happening in an enclosed space like a car and the car is moving, there's a lot you can do with that to differentiate the action visually from what the movie-going audience is used to seeing. And to do a large series of action sequences at an opera house, that's a very grandiose location, and many operas, including the one that they used, are very dramatic. So using that as a score elevates the dramatic impact of the action. Also, Bill is such a visceral actor. His approach to acting is to bring a lot of intensity and energy, and it really aids the action because you never lose that emotional connection to what's going on internally for Eric while these big action sequences are happening. I was hoping that the music for this film would be good, and I have to say I did enjoy quite a few of the choices that were made. There was one song in particular that I heard and I just went, is this really happening right now? Are we using this artist for this moment? And they were in fact doing that. I loved that choice. I will say which artist I'm talking about and which part of the film it was in the spoiler section, but I'm assuming that if you saw the film, you already know exactly which part I'm talking about. Another interesting tidbit I got from that Esquire interview was when they asked Chad Stahelski about Bill being the one to lead a new Crow film. For anyone that needs the context, Chad Stahelski, who came up in Hollywood working in stunts but transitioned to directing, now he's best known for directing the John Wick films. Chad Stahelski directed Bill when Bill appeared as the villain of John Wick 4, and Chad also came to work on the 1994 Crow after Brandon died to be a body double for the last few shots that Brandon was not able to complete before that tragic accident. When Chad was asked about Bill playing Eric, he said the following: "When I heard Bill was doing it, I was like, That's a good take. He adds, I knew Bill was going to bring something different. Bill's got that ethereal nature that makes him feel out of this world, or from another planet or existence. This is very much an accurate description of what Bill brings to this role, if not all of his roles. I'm not saying he's better or worse than Brandon Lee. They're different actors playing different stories from the same source material, and they both bring something incredible to the part. Bill has to play so many different sides of Eric, since you get to see who Eric is before he meets Shelley, how he blossoms by being with her, and the transformation that he undergoes from both losing her and then also obtaining this supernatural power to go on this vengeance quest. Bill shows so much range to this part, and I really enjoyed watching all of that. I want to talk about the ending briefly. I will not give any specifics as we are not out of the spoiler-free section. I had seen some headlines floating around online where it was making it seem as though Bill was claiming that the ending of The Crow had been changed somehow to set up a sequel, or at least that was the impression I had. I didn't look into it at the time because I wanted to try to avoid the full details of spoilers until I could see the film. After I saw The Crow, I went to this Esquire interview and I read the following. Back in Central Park, Skarsgård opens up about the fact that now, 2 years after filming Wrapped, he feels a certain distance from the work. As with most topics, he is refreshingly candid. That includes when discussing the ending of The Crow. I won't spoil what happens, but I will tell you that Skarsgård would have voted for a different conclusion. Why film it the way they did? It made the path for a sequel easier, his answer suggests. I personally preferred something more definitive. Without getting into the full specifics just yet, when I watched The Crow, I did not get the impression that it was ending in such a way to set up a sequel. It felt like a conclusion. Now, if the film turned into a massive commercial success, would I assume that higher-ups would try to move forward with a sequel? Sure, that's the standard way that Hollywood likes to operate. However, this new Crow film, as it stands on its own as a work of fiction, to me, it felt like a complete story with a clear beginning, middle, and end. I can speculate a bit more on what Bill might have wanted to see in the spoiler section, but for now, I will say that I didn't feel like the film ended with an unresolved cliffhanger that will never have closure unless a sequel somehow gets greenlit. Overall, I gave The Crow 2024 4 stars. I had fun watching it. Bill and FKA Twigs were getting me emotionally invested in the love story of Eric and Shelley. I loved the visuals and aesthetics and all of that fun action. There were one or two things with the story and pacing that I could nitpick. I will talk a bit more about some of those once we get to spoilers, but the film followed through on a lot of what I thought held promise from watching the trailer that I talked about in my previous video about The Crow. If you are a romance girly and you want to see a gothy 2000s-esque spooky tragic love story, then I would say that The Crow 2024 might be worth checking out.
I'm gonna kill them. Every single one of them.
Now let's talk about spoilers. The film opens with a brief flashback to young Eric. It's sort of presented as a dream that he's having from his past, and it's done to establish how he has lived a painful life from childhood into adulthood. When you put that into context of the full film and what we come to learn about both Eric and Shelley, because you eventually learn that Shelley's mother was a key figure in putting Shelley into this really harmful, dangerous situation that directly leads to Shelley and Eric's death. It's a good opening because it deepens the viewer's understanding of what Shelley and Eric have in common. If you struggle with the idea of seeing something that's seemingly an insta-love connection, I would argue that there is more in the narrative to contextualize why they would feel so drawn to one another as quickly as they are. They have things in common. The villains in this film are supernatural, which is different from the source material and the earlier film. In those older versions, the bad guys, well, they're just doing violence because they're bad people. In this new version, the villains are part of this organization where they send innocent souls to hell so that they can reap the benefits, the wealth, the power, and so on and so forth in return. Danny Huston is the main villain, and he has this demonic voice that he can use to get inside people's minds and control them, make them succumb to the darkest parts of themselves. We see him use it to make people unalive themselves, make someone take another person's life. So overall, just a very bad demonic man. And Danny Huston, he seems to get typecast as villains, but there's a reason for that. He's very good good at playing them. This is an intriguing premise, and anytime you have some sort of nefarious secret organization, it's natural to have some questions, and I think some reviews are leaning more negative because they are saying things like they want to know more about what this organization does, how they came to be in this position, but again, I will reiterate, I don't think it's necessary in the grand scheme of things. The original villains of The Crow never had that level of exploration or development. This version had far more going on, and I would argue that it was more thematically interesting and rich compared to the original versions, because one of the many hench people that Eric takes out is this blonde woman, and she gives a brief speech to Eric before he ends her. He had asked her something about her being involved in everything and being responsible for the deaths of Shelley and himself and loads of other people. And this blonde henchwoman, she talks about how it starts off small. You're aware of bad things that are happening, but it's sort of out of sight, out of mind. And then there's this gradual escalation until you're inevitably swallowed up by it. I'm not perfectly paraphrasing it, but it stuck out to me as something unexpectedly poignant. It was something that was very easy for me to connect to larger examples of how the most evil, powerful people operate and the ways that they do. Now, if they had explored this further, I would not have been opposed to that. But at the same time, if they were trying to keep things closer to a 2-hour runtime, I am glad that they ultimately chose to use more of that runtime to build up the love story of Eric and Shelley and to give them that time to fall in love with one another, because it made her loss more devastating and it directly informed the viewer's understanding of what is driving Eric to try to save her. This is another difference with this specific version. In the other versions, the print and 1994 film, Eric is resurrected by a crow and he starts going on a vengeance quest. In this new version, Eric finds himself in this limbo place where there's a sort of spirit guide named Kronos who tells Eric that Shelley's soul is incorrectly being sent to hell because of this evil group of people who are not supposed to be on Earth. They don't belong there, and Shelley does not belong in hell. The crows are part of the magical lore and a source of power, but it's not overly explained. They're in this place of limbo where Eric is told about what he can do. Eric is initially told that if he takes out the bad guys, then he and Shelley will be able to live again. If his love for Shelley stays true, then he will be able to have this supernatural magic invincibility. However, when Eric discovers a video of Shelley being compelled by Danny Houston, using that evil demonic voice of his, to kill someone, Eric is shaken by this, and this makes him no longer invulnerable to injury. So when he ends up back in the limbo place, he offers to trade his soul for Shelley's, so even if he is successful and takes out all the bad guys, he will never be able to live with Shelley again. I feel like this was an extra step that didn't need to be there. I think the story would have been just as effective and compelling if they had made the deal from the very beginning be, you take out all the bad guys and Shelley will be saved from hell. Adding this extra step and detour in the story, it felt like the ripple effects of this plot detail caused some issues with the pacing. That bit of runtime could have been better used on things like exploring more details with this evil organization and more time for Eric and Shelley's love story. Some viewers have felt like the love story was happening too fast, or at least that's the vibe I'm getting. I can see some of where they're coming from, but again, I still found it completely believable. It got me invested. Removing that detour and changing of the deal, it would have freed up some of the space to flesh out those other two aspects that some viewers seem to have wanted more details from. Why are you dangling the promise of living again in front of Eric's face when the crow's premise was always that Eric is not going to live again once he completes his vengeance quest? Ultimately, Eric does save Shelley, and their reunion actually got me really emotional when Eric was telling her one last time that he loves her and he's making this final declaration before she will be sent back to Earth. I cried. I did. It was effective and believable, and anyone with the gall to claim that Bill and FKA Twigs did not have chemistry should probably reevaluate some internal biases they've got going on. I want to talk now about Bill's earlier quote where he was saying he wanted the ending to be more definitive. So here's what happens. Eric completes his vengeance quest, he takes out all the villains, and Shelley is saved from hell. And Eric's narration says that their love will live on through her as she is able to live out her life. The ending did not feel like it wasn't definitive. Now, if I were to speculate on what Bill wanted, he's Mr. Dark and Twisted. I would assume that he wanted to see some sort of Eric gets dragged to hell like it's a Sam Raimi film type of ending. Regardless, if I was not aware of those misleading headlines, I would have never thought that the film had ended in a way that was going to set up a sequel. If you saw the film and you feel like they were somehow sequel baiting, feel free to let me know in the comments what detail you think was an indication of that. But what I saw was Shelley being resurrected, she's surrounded by EMTs, and she's crying seeing Eric lying next to her, and the EMTs are not able to resuscitate him. Now I want to go through and share a few miscellaneous details of other things that I loved. After the opening childhood flashback of Eric, I love that we were introduced immediately to Shelley. It really started the film off in a way that set it apart with its own take on the material instead of rehashing the versions that we've already experienced in print and in 1994. It also felt refreshing to actually get to know Shelley and see the stakes of the story in action through her. We see that there is this external threat coming for Shelley before she's even met Eric, and in a way that's also working well to enhance the element of tragedy in this tragic romance. You see that something's hunting for her, and that looms over their love story as we watch them meet and fall in love. When I saw them interact in the facility where they met, the part where they were at what appeared to be a cinema. Genuine question, what sobriety facility has a giant cinema? It looked really nice. That's another one of those details in addition to their really cute pink loungewear uniforms that made me feel like this story is playing out in its own universe. It's not meant to visually replicate the world that we live in. I love that they showed Eric and Shelley bonding over music, not only because FKA Twigs established herself first and foremost as a music artist before beginning to branch out into more of these Hollywood film projects. Eric being a musician is part of the larger lore of The Crow. It's also just a really sweet domestic moment that further conveys their romantic compatibility and connection. The part where Eric makes the deal to trade his soul for Shelley's and his spirit guide reaches out to touch his eyes, and it creates the first visual we ever see of Eric with the iconic heavy eyeliner. I was hyped. I was having so much fun. It felt like a huge moment and milestone. I had been waiting to finally see him with the look. I love a bold look. That's why I wanted to make my eyeshadow a bit obnoxiously heavier than usual, to pay homage. I wasn't about to do the full paint, but I wanted to expand the range of how far I blended out this look. Anyway, following that point, when Eric has his first moment back on Earth where he is the one to create the iconic eye look, you have no idea how enormous my reaction was when they started playing Enya. I thought to myself, is this really happening? We're playing Enya in the eyeliner montage. Oh no, the pretentious critics could never make me hate this. They understand who they were making this film for. Who did they make it for? Me. I've said this before, but if you are new here, if you pick the right song or songs in a film, that will enhance my overall impression. Now, it's not enough on its own, but it will make me give you extra points. I love a good musical needle drop. I have talked about this before on my channel. I love a bold, memorable soundtrack. That's probably why Baz Luhrmann is one of my favorite filmmakers. Anyone that's seen the film will be unsurprised to hear me co-sign what more or less everyone else has said about praising the entire opera sequence, but I will just say that it's well-deserved praise. The action was excellent. I already talked about that moment between Eric and the blonde henchwoman, but I also absolutely love the fact that when the whole thing ends, Eric takes the heads out onto the stage at the curtain call. That was how I knew they understand what movie they're making. We are here to see a show. Nothing wrong with a bit of dramatic flair while you're doing your vengeance quest. I also think it's interesting that the villains were all part of this upper echelon of the most wealthy and powerful, so they can afford to go to this really high-end opera house. And here is someone who comes from a rough, economically poor upbringing, trying to avenge and rescue the woman he loves, who was herself sold out by her mother in exchange for upward mobility. Could they have elaborated more on these thematic details? Sure, but even if you don't interpret the material that way, Bill's Eric was serving me stunt queen, so either way, you're not going to hear any complaints from me. I also found it an interesting detail that Eric feels the pain of his wounds when he's been resurrected. My mind immediately went to that scene of Brandon Lee's Crow where he's shot in the hand and he's cackling as it heals. It's an apples and oranges thing, all right? I don't think one interpretation is better or worse than the other. Brandon's Eric is more of this otherworldly spirit, pure vengeance, striking fear into the people he's coming after. And then with Bill's Eric, he does feel that pain, which further externalizes the internal emotional pain of the character, which suits this interpretation of the story better because it's showcasing a lot more of the love story between Eric and Shelley. Neither one is right or wrong, they're just different. I suppose that's my general stance on the whole situation of people trying to pit the films against one another. I like both of them. They are offering different things. As a romance girly, I think Bill and FKA Twigs' Crow is more frequently the one I would be inclined to gravitate towards, simply because I like being able to see more of that love story play out on screen. And not only that, it's the fact that it's a tragic love story, and I'm a James Cameron fan. I am always seated and ready to watch the leading man sacrifice himself for the woman he loves. I'm more than understanding that lots of people don't like this new version, but early on I got the sense that it would be well suited to match many of the things I happen to enjoy in fiction, and it did deliver those things. Sure, there were some elements I would have tweaked, but I still had a fun time watching it. It's one of my favorite releases of August, and August in general has been a really fun month for me. It's been this, Trap, and Cuckoo. If no one else likes Bill and FKA Twigs' The Crow, that's fine, but I know that I can still revisit this film to satiate my proclivity for a 2000s gothy tragic romance.
What's the first thing you liked about me?
I thought that you were quite brilliantly broken.